This week on Jerusalem Dateline, the debate over the Iranian nuclear deal intensifies. Is it the way to stop Iran from getting a nuclear bomb, or will it lead to war in the Middle East? Plus, an in-depth interview with former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren. And has America fallen too far from its founding principles? All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Israel today could be facing its deadliest threat ever from a nuclear Iran. President Obama says his deal will prevent Iran from building nuclear weapons. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the deal could guarantee that Iran gets the bomb. Israel is lobbying against the deal, while the Obama administration is pushing in favor of it, as Congress begins its 60-day period to review the agreement. Most Americans who are familiar with the Iranian nuclear deal are against it. 48% disapprove, while 38% approve, according to a new poll from the Pew Research Center. The poll comes as Defense Secretary Ashton Carter visited Israel to talk with Israeli leaders about the new nuclear agreement with Iran. Israel continues to warn it's a danger, and not just to Israel. After Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met with U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter, he still called it a bad deal.
Yet today we are told that the whole world supports this bad deal. Well, that's just not true. Israel and many Arab states oppose this deal. And in any case, sometimes the entire world can be wrong.
As the debate over the agreement shifts to Capitol Hill, Israeli officials are calling attention to the danger that Iran poses not just to Israel, but to the United States.
When we're speaking about Iran, we are dealing with a country whose leadership calls for death to America. It's not as though that Israel is taking action because it alone is in the crosshairs of the Iranians or of the Iranian military. The United States is in the crosshairs of the Iranian military.
Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, Dori Gold, told reporters Iran not only shouts death to America, but also operates inside the United States.
America is targeted by Iran. Hezbollah today, which is, let's be clear about it, Hezbollah is an extension of the Iranian security apparatus. It has networks in Europe and in the United States. And we say that both the Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah are operating in 30 countries, according to our best information.
Despite the worldwide influence of Hezbollah and Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the agreement gives a long list, 70 pages worth of Iranian companies, entities, and individuals freedom from sanctions. That will represent a windfall for Iran's economy. And critics warn that Iran can use some of that money to fund terrorist activities around the world. The UN Security Council voted unanimously to adopt the deal. It will lift UN sanctions off of Iran in exchange for curbing its nuclear program. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Ron Prosser, spoke out against the vote.
Ladies and gentlemen, today you have awarded a great prize to the most dangerous country in the world. For the first time anyone can remember, Israel and the Arab world see eye to eye. This deal is dangerous for the region, for the people of the region, Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, and for the entire world.
The deal gives Iran up to $150 billion in sanctions relief, and new business could add $500 to $700 billion to the Iranian economy in the next decade. Critics say Iran could use some of that money to support terrorism. Both Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill criticized the Obama administration for going to the UN before taking it to Congress. After the deal, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei vowed Iran's policy toward what he called the arrogant United States would not change and pledged to support its jihadist allies in the region. In the meantime, as one more sign of growing tensions in the region, 47% of Israelis would support a unilateral strike against Iran's nuclear program. Dale Hurd talked with David Waltzer, Israel's ambassador to the European Union and NATO, about the situation with Iran and other issues facing the Jewish state.
Joining us now at our CBN News studios in Brussels is Israeli Ambassador to the European Union and NATO, Ambassador David Waltzer. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
What is at play here? Why make a deal with a country that has such a bad track record?
I think that if you look at our region, the broader region, the wider Middle East, leaders, by and large, in the international community, tend to deal or tend to put out fires which are burning our fingers, and not deal with what's important, but with what is burning. And the notion that Iran can be, or might be, or should be a partner for us, the international community, I mean, in solving problems in the region, and therefore we better strike a deal with it, I think this is a big mistake. If you look at Iran's proxies in the region, all the way from Hezbollah in Lebanon, to the Shiites in Iraq, to the Houthis in Yemen, to what's going on in Syria, you can understand that a nuclear Iran, or Iran after a deal, Iran which will be equipped with much more money to support its struggle for dominance in the region, is a much more problematic, a much more dangerous. Some have even said, so what? Either we strike a deal or we go to war with Iran. I'm sorry, but those are not the only options. The international community has proven that tough sanctions do work, and Iran has come to the table. So why not go on using the measure you have been implementing successfully?
How would you characterize relations between the Obama White House and Prime Minister Netanyahu's government?
We have disagreements, and disagreements on some fundamental and basic issues, but those occur in the most intimate companies of even within families. So hostility, I don't think, reflects the reality of our relations. I think that Israel and the United States, or should I say, the United States and Israel, are very close allies and very good friends.
Are you surprised that we're again dealing with anti-Semitism in Europe?
I'm not sure whether I'm surprised, but I hoped very much that 70 years after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism will definitely, or will never be on the rise again in Europe. And the fact that we are talking about it today, and the fact that Jews in this continent ask themselves whether they should stay here or leave, by itself is frightening.
Is the time of the Jews in Europe over?
I think that the threat is growing, and the dangers are much bigger than they used to be. By the end of the day, it should be the decision of every person whether he wants to pack and leave for Israel or for the States or for anywhere in the world. I think that the fact that people ask themselves this question is by itself frightening. Mind you, Jews have lived in this continent for thousands of years. The fact that they have to ask themselves whether it is still their home is by itself frightening.
I can't help but ask, is there a feeling that in Israel that you're losing friends in the world, that the number of nations you can count on continues to shrink?
We would like to be, if you wish, more popular, but we will stay the course. Mm-hmm. We know that we fight for something which is just, and we will stay the course.
Well, I know our many CBN viewers that support Israel are praying for Israel and standing with it. Ambassador David Waltzer, thank you for joining us.
Again, thanks for having me.
Up next, we talk with Middle East expert Jonathan Spire about how the nuclear talks will affect the region. Welcome back. Just before the Iranian deal was struck, we talked with Middle East expert Jonathan Spire about how the nuclear deal with Iran would affect the region. He told us it would lead to a nuclear arms race.
Well, it'll be a much more dangerous and volatile region, a region that is already very volatile politically in terms of being split by powerful states opposing one another in areas in which governance has effectively collapsed. The Iranians versus the Saudis/Turks/Qataris, also in Syria, also in Iraq in a different way, also in Yemen in a different way. All those existing conflicts will be, of course, exacerbated by the parallel presence of a nuclear arms race and of proliferation of nuclear arms in the region. It'll exponentially increase the dangers in an already very dangerous neighborhood.
And also about the sanctions relief that seems tied to the negotiations. It could release billions of dollars back to Iran. What impact would that have on the region?
It will be huge. If this happens, it will be huge. The figure which many analysts talk about is $150 billion sitting there, mainly in frozen oil revenue. If that comes back online in the coming months, this will be an enormous shot in the arm for the Iranians, who are in danger of looking a little bit overstretched in recent months. They've got commitments in Syria, they've got the commitment in Iraq we were discussing earlier, they're committed to supporting the Houthis in Yemen, they're committed of course also to Hezbollah in Lebanon, they're supporting also Islamic Jihad and maybe also Hamas among the Palestinians. It's a big portfolio of support. It requires a lot of money for a state under heavy sanctions to cope with. If the sanctions are lifted and tens or hundreds of billions of dollars suddenly become available again, of course the Iranians will be in a happy position from their point of view to exponentially increase the support to their various beleaguered friends and allies and clients across the region.
Then if a negotiation could lead to a nuclear arms race and then pour billions of dollars into these conflicts around the Middle East, what possible explanation is there for a deal with Iran then?
As far as I understand the thinking of the US administration in this regard, and their European allies of course as well, it is that they believe that Iran is willing or is in a position to be flipped, so to speak, from an anti-Western force into a neutral or pro-Western force in the region. There are even some, and I read an article in the British Daily Telegraph newspaper this week by former British Ambassador Christopher Mayer, former Ambassador to the United States, who argues that Iran, once it's flipped, once it's got its deal, could actually become a factor of order, could become a Western ally in the region. So there is this very strongly held belief that Iran is just waiting to be given sufficient inducements to become a reasonable player in the region. And that's underlying all this stuff that's going on. My own estimation as somebody who watches this region pretty closely is that there is no content to that belief whatsoever. The Iranians are very serious about their anti-American stance, which goes back, of course, 30 years, very serious about their desire to destroy Israel, about their opposition to Sunnis and other presence in the region, and their sectarian interest and their strong Shia Islamist ideology, absolutely serious about that. And if they're given inducements, they'll happily take the inducements and feed those into the continued promotion of the already existing strategy that they have, which is to replace the United States as the hegemonic presence in the Gulf and also further across the region.
If you were talking to somebody in the United States or somebody in the West, Great Britain or Europe, what would you say, what do they need to understand about what's happening in the Middle East right now?
I think what they need to understand is two things. First and most importantly, that the Iranians are not available to be turned into allies. And secondly, of course, that Sunni jihadi Islamism represents not existential, but a very, very profound danger to the security of Western countries themselves and Western populations. Given that, what they need to be doing is identifying what allies do they have in these collapsed state areas of Iraq and Syria and elsewhere. And once they identify those allies, beginning to work with them to create a new coherent security architecture in the region, because there's plenty of people who want to be friends with the West in the region. Israel, of course, the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, the Gulf monarchies, the Jordanians, the Egyptians under Sisi. It's a pretty strong team. But right now it's a team that feels that the West just hasn't got behind it and the West is flailing about with all other kinds of ideas. What needs to happen is the danger needs to be addressed, and then the allies need to be coordinated and developed.
Coming up, an in-depth interview with Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., about his new book on U.S.-Israeli relations. Welcome back. Over the last 6 years, the relationship between President Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has deteriorated. And all the while, Michael Oren, the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., has had a front row seat. Jennifer Wishon talked with him about how things have gone between the U.S. and Israel during the Obama years and what can be done to repair the damage.
How would you characterize right now the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
On one hand, the relationships really have never been better. Support for Israel in this country is pretty much at an all-time high. We have a certain difficult and complex relationship with this administration because the president had a worldview. The worldview included very open support for the Palestinian cause, an open attempt to reconcile with Iran, and Iran wants to destroy us. So there's already a problem. The deal on the table now, which enables Iran to keep all of its nuclear infrastructure, its centrifuges, its facilities, that doesn't include research and development. They could make more advanced machinery that would enrich uranium even faster. That doesn't include the missiles. That it's not linked to Iran's behavior. Iran is the world's largest sponsor of state terrorism. If the agreement is not attached and linked in any way to a change in Iran's behavior, then it's a bad deal. And it endangers my country. But beyond that, it will endanger America. And people have to internalize that. I know it sounds very abstract, but understand they have missiles, and those missiles will be able to reach this studio in a matter of years. And those missiles have one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to carry a nuclear warhead. Can the damage that you say that President Obama has wrought on U.S.-Israeli relations be repaired? One of the most cardinal things we can do is restore these two principles of what's called no daylight, no surprises. No daylight means we can disagree about all sorts of things, and two countries, even the closest allies, will disagree. But it's very important that we don't have our disagreements out in front of the world, because our enemies, our common enemies, will interpret that as weakness, and they'll use it against us. You're a member of the Knesset now. I am. Legislating is hard. We have a different political culture. In the Knesset, you yell and scream. So you'd never think of doing it in the Congress. People, they don't exactly curse one another out, but I think if the seats weren't screwed down, people would be throwing them. All this is happening a 2-hour drive from ISIS. All right, the distance between where we're sitting in Philadelphia. You say that your greatest accomplishment, your greatest joy is having Israeli grandchildren. I just think that I'm the luckiest man going to be alive in history at this moment. And to come to this country, Israel, and to start with nothing. I came with a backpack, and back then it was 40 years ago, it was like the Wild West, and to build a family, and then to look at these two Israeli grandchildren is my greatest accomplishment in life.
Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Washington.
Up next, has America lost its way and fallen too far from its founding principles? We examine if it's time for a U-turn for the U.S. Welcome back. Recently, America marked its 239th Independence Day, the birth of what many consider the greatest nation on earth. But as Paul Strand reports, many Americans worry that the country has fallen so far from its historic values that it's doomed, unless it makes a serious U-turn.
This time of year, Americans are used to celebrating the nation's birthday and its greatness, but they may soon be mourning its downfall. That's the conclusion of researcher George Barna and historian David Barton in their book, U-Turn, Restoring America to the Strength of Its Roots.
These authors say that the U.S. is entering its own version of the Dark Ages, that any civilization that's gone where America is headed now has gone to ruin.
The founders gave us an amazing foundation, and for us to trample on it and say we're going to build a new one is folly.
The authors point out those early Americans were shaped by the Bible and a Judeo-Christian worldview.
They believed everybody should read through the Bible cover to cover once a year. That's what we did in school. That's what we did in spiritual life. That's what political leaders did. Not today. We can't even get Christians to read that word.
Today, only 30% of Christians read the Bible, and less than 10% from cover to cover. And it shows.
Only 9% of born-again Christians have a biblical worldview. Only 51% of pastors have a biblical worldview.
It's led to a complete change in values over 240 years. Then, service to others ruled the day.
Your order of responsibilities is God, country, and family. And so that's part of the biblical thinking they had, which is why the Founding Fathers were told, and specifically taught in schools, we have their textbooks, if someone comes to you and say, we need you to run for office, you're not allowed to say no. You said, I will run. Because, as they point out, your life doesn't belong to you.
Today, it's all about me.
Now we're just worried about comfort and experiences and entertainment and security.
That's led to a world of things that can pile up the kind of debt that can kill a country.
The average American family, they're looking usually at a mortgage debt of about $130,000. They're usually looking at a credit card debt of about $21,000. They're looking at a car debt of about $23,000, a college loan debt of about $24,000. And so we're so far in debt that we tolerate it in others.
Like our federal government.
Where we are right now, it will take 107 years of the full production of the American economy to pay off the debt we have right now. We are at a point now where 60% of Americans receive more from the government than what they put in. You can't sustain that.
Compare that to what Thomas Jefferson said.
We can live in debt and extravagance, but we'll be in slavery, or we can be free, but we have to use frugality. George Washington said, avoid occasions of expense. If you want to stay out of debt, just quit spending. And so the Founding Fathers very, very, very clear that what would destroy a nation is debt.
So where's that indicate America's headed?
Into the ash heap of history.
Reverend Sam Rohr invited Barna and Barton to address this gathering of the Pennsylvania Pastors Network because he wants a different outcome.
God's judgment on America and his hand of judgment, which is very obviously here, will put us down on our knees until we look up.
Church folks often say, look at what those people are doing to wreck our country. But Barna and Barton found in their research over and over again that church people are just as guilty as their government, as secular people, of the same kind of ruinous behaviors that are taking the nation down.
In a country that between 78–80% say they're Christian, but only 34% believe in absolute moral truth.
Barna on a regular basis asks Christians and non-Christians about 70 moral categories. And these days he's finding no substantive statistical difference between Christians and non-Christians when it comes to most moral issues.
Stop pointing the finger and look at ourselves and say, are we really the church that Christ died on the cross for?
Rohr says the church should be confessing to God.
We are the problem. We have walked away from you, and the culture has followed us, not the other way around.
Barna says today's Americans believe they're smarter than the founders, maybe because of education and technology. But the founders had that biblical foundation.
They didn't have all the things that we think are necessary to have a sophisticated society today. But the key isn't sophistication. You know, it's wisdom, it's discernment, it's love, it's grace.
And so until we get back into God's plan and know what his plan is, we'll never get the nation back to where it needs to be.
Today we think that mankind has evolved. We're smarter and wiser than those people who founded the country hundreds of years ago. And yet they were so wise that they founded the greatest nation on the earth, while today's generation are well on their way to losing it. Paul Strand, CBN News, reporting from Lancaster Bible College.
Well, Paul's story is a powerful reminder that what happens to the U.S. also has an impact here in Israel and throughout the Middle East. That's it for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Please follow us through the week on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.